The quiet panic. You know what's wild about the human brain? We're hardwired to dismiss things as fiction, as just stories, until the moment they become our reality. That split second when your comfortable little bubble of disbelief gets absolutely shattered and suddenly you're living through something you thought only happened to other people. I've been collecting stories for years now. Stories that sound too crazy to be true, too twisted for reality, too nightmare-inducing to actually happen. But here's the thing about these particular stories. They all have one thing in common. Every single person who lived through them started their day thinking they were just going about their normal routine. Today I'm sharing 3 accounts that will make you question everything you think you know about safety, about the predictability of your daily life, and about how quickly ordinary situations can spiral into something straight out of your worst nightmares. These aren't urban legends passed down through generations or creepypasta written for internet points. These are real experiences from real people who were kind enough to share their stories with me. But before we dive in, I need to set some expectations here. These stories are intense. They involve situations where people genuinely feared for their lives, where split-second decisions meant the difference between making it home that night or becoming a statistic. If you're someone who gets easily spooked or you're watching this alone at night, maybe save this one for tomorrow morning when you've got some sunlight streaming through your windows. Now, what makes these stories particularly chilling isn't just what happened. It's how normal everything seemed right up until the moment it wasn't. You'll notice a pattern in all 3 accounts. Each person was just going through the motions of their regular day when reality decided to take a hard left turn into something they never could have prepared for. The first story takes place in what should be one of the safest environments imaginable. A place where parents send their children every day without a second thought, where teachers dedicate their lives to nurturing young minds, where the biggest worry is usually a pop quiz or a forgotten homework assignment. But on this particular day, that sense of security was about to be tested in the most terrifying way possible. Our storyteller was just another student sitting in what they describe as a typical boring day in calculus. It was Friday 7th period, meaning the week was almost over and spring break was finally within reach. You know that feeling. That restless energy when you can practically taste freedom and your mind is already checked out for vacation. The teacher, being the laid-back type, had even decided to abandon the lesson plan and play some games on Sporkle instead. Picture this scene for a moment. A classroom full of teenagers, probably half asleep, definitely not paying attention, just counting down the minutes until they could bolt out those doors and start their break. The most exciting thing happening was trying to remember brand logos on some online quiz. About as mundane as a Friday afternoon gets, right? Then came that moment, that precise instant when everything changed. The storyteller remembers it with crystal clarity. Right after their friend answered a question about Adidas, the dean's voice crackled through the loudspeaker. But this wasn't the usual administrative announcement about buses or upcoming events. The dean sounded panicked, frantic even, as he told all teachers this was not a drill and to go into lockdown immediately. Now, most of us have been through lockdown drills, their routine almost boring in their predictability. Teachers lock doors, students huddle in corners, everyone waits quietly for the all clear. It's become such a standard part of school safety that kids barely register it anymore. But this time was different. You could feel it in the air, in the way their usually calm teacher suddenly transformed into someone our storyteller barely recognized. The lights went out. Students were ushered to the back corner. The familiar hum of the electrical panel fell silent as the school cut all power. This wasn't following the typical drill protocol, and everyone in that room knew it. The atmosphere shifted from casual Friday afternoon vibes to something much more sinister. But the real terror hadn't even begun yet. Because what happened next would haunt everyone in that classroom for the rest of their lives. The sound that came echoing down the hallway wasn't the measured footsteps of security doing their rounds or the voice of an administrator checking on classrooms. It was screaming. Raw, unhinged screaming from what sounded like someone who had completely lost touch with reality. The man's voice grew closer, and with it came the sound of metal being struck violently as he banged on lockers while shouting threats that made everyone's blood run cold. "I'll kill all of you." Those words, delivered by someone who sounded genuinely unhinged, transformed a routine school day into every parent's worst nightmare and every student's most terrifying experience. 2 girls in the class started crying, which only amplified the fear rippling through the room. When you're in a situation like that, other people's terror becomes contagious. Their fear feeds your fear until the entire room is consumed by this primal understanding that something is very, very wrong. Then the banging moved from the lockers to their classroom door. The barrier between them and whatever was happening in the hallway suddenly seemed impossibly thin. The man outside was demanding entry, screaming for them to open up, and when one of the crying girls couldn't contain her fear any longer and screamed no, it only seemed to make him more aggressive. Picture yourself in that moment. You're trapped in a dark room, huddled with your classmates, listening to someone who sounds completely unhinged, trying to break down your door. Your heart is pounding so hard you're sure everyone can hear it. Your mind is racing through every possible scenario, most of them ending badly. Time stretches out like taffy. Seconds feel like minutes, minutes feel like hours. The banging continued, growing more violent, more desperate. The man's screaming intensified, and for those students pressed against the back wall of that classroom, it felt like an eternity of pure terror. They had no way of knowing if he was armed, no way of knowing his intentions beyond the threats he was shouting. No way of knowing if that door would hold. Eventually, the sounds moved away. The screaming voice faded as the intruder continued down the hallway, still ranting like someone completely detached from reality. But even with the immediate threat gone, the fear lingered. Because nobody knew where he went, what he was doing, or if he would come back. When the dean finally came back on the loudspeaker to explain what had happened, it only confirmed their worst fears. A mentally unstable person had entered the building, assaulted the woman at the front desk, and sent her fleeing in terror. Staff couldn't locate him and weren't even sure if he was armed. The school, lacking proper security measures and cameras at that time, was completely vulnerable to this kind of intrusion. The most disturbing detail came later. Discovered by a night janitor who found the intruder sleeping in a storage closet. According to the rumors that spread through the school, protruding from his pocket was a .44 Magnum. Whether the janitor made a mistake that woke him up or the man left on his own, by the time police arrived, he had vanished without a trace. To this day, our storyteller doesn't know if that man was ever caught, if he got the help he clearly needed, or if he's still out there somewhere. But what they do know is that in the span of about 30 minutes, their entire understanding of safety and normalcy was completely shattered. This is what I mean when I say they're just stories until they aren't. One moment you're sitting in calculus class playing online games, the next you're wondering if you'll make it home alive. But that's just the beginning of how quickly ordinary situations can transform into living nightmares. Because sometimes the danger doesn't announce itself with screaming and banging doors. Sometimes it's much more subtle, much more calculated, and infinitely more terrifying because of it. Our second story takes us to what should be another safe haven. A middle school campus during lunch period. Picture a typical October day, overcast and rainy. The kind of weather that makes you grateful to be inside. Students are going through their usual routines, some buying lunch, others already settled in with their friends, everyone just living their normal lives without a care in the world. The storyteller remembers hearing 4 loud booms during the first lunch period. Their initial thought, thunder, made perfect sense given the stormy weather outside. But sometimes our logical explanations are dead wrong, and this was one of those times. Because suddenly, the entire lunch crowd erupted into screaming. Now, when you're in middle school, kids scream about everything. Someone spills milk, someone gets embarrassed, someone sees a bug. The drama levels are always cranked up to 11. So our storyteller's first instinct was to dismiss it as typical teenage overreaction. Just kids being kids, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Campus security came rushing in, shouting orders for everyone to move into the multi-purpose room immediately. Students who were still in line buying lunch had to abandon their food and follow the crowd. This wasn't a drill, this wasn't practice, this was the real thing happening in real time. The multi-purpose room was massive, and one entire wall was made of floor-to-ceiling glass windows, perfect for letting in natural light during normal circumstances, but absolutely terrifying when you're trying to hide from an unknown threat. Security personnel immediately began covering those windows with curtains while adults positioned themselves at every possible exit. Curiosity might kill the cat, but it also drives middle schoolers to ask questions even in the most inappropriate moments. When one student approached an adult to find out what was happening, the answer was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Right across from the school, in the houses that bordered the campus, a mentally disabled man had barricaded himself on his property. But this wasn't just someone having a bad day or a minor breakdown. This individual was threatening to commit suicide and kill any police officers who tried to evict him. And here's where it gets worse. He had been walking around outside the school, watching the children in what witnesses described as a deeply unsettling way. The revelation that this man was also a registered sex offender sent chills through everyone who heard it. Suddenly, those four loud booms took on a completely different meaning. This wasn't thunder at all. This was someone with serious mental health issues, a history of predatory behavior, and apparent access to firearms, having a complete breakdown right next to a school full of children. For an entire hour, hundreds of students were trapped in that multi-purpose room, missing 2 full class periods while adults tried to manage a situation that could have gone sideways in countless horrific ways. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew something serious was happening, but the not knowing was almost worse than knowing. When it was finally over and students were escorted back to their classrooms one by one, the full scope of the situation began to emerge through whispered conversations and shared rumors. But perhaps the most chilling detail came from a student whose house was right next to where this man lived. The previous Halloween, she had seen him at his window, cutting his own arm and writing messages in his blood on the glass. Messages like, "Come here or I'll kill you." At the time, everyone assumed it was just an elaborate Halloween decoration, dark, twisted, inappropriate maybe, but just holiday theatrics, except it wasn't. It was a glimpse into the mind of someone who was genuinely dangerous, someone who lived close enough to watch children walk to and from school every single day. The Halloween incident that seemed like harmless spookiness was actually a red flag that nobody recognized until it was almost too late. Think about that for a moment. How many times do we see something unsettling and rationalize it away? How many warning signs do we dismiss because we want to believe everything is fine? This girl and her family probably drove past this man's house hundreds of times, walked by his property, lived their daily lives within shouting distance of someone who was clearly unstable. The scariest part isn't what happened that October day. It's how long this dangerous individual was hiding in plain sight, integrated into a neighborhood where children played and families felt safe. It's the realization that the threats we worry about aren't always strangers lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they're living right next door. Our third and final story might be the most terrifying of all, because it involves someone who thought they were safely hidden away from any possible danger, only to discover that nowhere is truly safe when someone with bad intentions decides to make you their target. This account comes from someone who had just graduated college and landed their first real job. They were working as a computer intern in the basement of their old high school, a position they got because their former teachers genuinely cared about them and wanted to help launch their career. It seemed like the perfect setup. Good relationships, familiar environment, steady work in a field they enjoyed. The basement office was actually pretty nice. 3 big desks, mini fridges, a flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, and most importantly, air conditioning that the rest of the school couldn't afford. It was like a hidden oasis beneath all the chaos of high school life. Our storyteller had 2 co-workers, Dave and Gary, who shared the space. And everything was going smoothly until one particular afternoon when everything went sideways. It was lunchtime, and our storyteller was alone in the office eating a sandwich when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was from the front office, delivering news that would transform a peaceful lunch break into a fight for survival. The school was on lockdown. Someone possibly armed had entered the building, and everyone needed to shelter in place immediately. Now remember, this person is in the basement. They're isolated from the main part of the school, cut off from most communication, with no real way to know what's happening upstairs. The office might have been nice, but it had one crucial flaw: no actual door. Just a big opening leading into the main basement area, and the door to the basement itself didn't even have a working lock. So there they were, turning off lights, shutting down computer screens, texting their co-workers who weren't responding, essentially trapped in a basement with no way to secure themselves and no information about what kind of threat they were hiding from. For 20 minutes, they sat in darkness, playing games on their phone, waiting for word that it was safe to resume normal activities. That's when they heard the basement door open. The sound echoed through the empty space, and footsteps started coming down the stairs. At first, there was hope. Maybe it was Dave or Gary coming to check on them. Maybe it was security doing a sweep of the building, but something felt off. The footsteps were too urgent, too panicked. Someone entered the office but didn't turn on the lights. In that moment of pure terror, our storyteller made the decision to hide under their desk, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But then their phone dinged with a text message, and they felt their entire world collapse. That tiny sound, barely audible under normal circumstances, felt like a gunshot in the tense silence. Footsteps moved closer. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing. Every instinct screamed that discovery meant death. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, they emerged from under the desk, begging whoever it was not to kill them. The person grabbed their arm and helped them up. It was a man in a red plaid shirt, jeans, and a reddish-black cap. He seemed concerned, claiming he was just hiding too, asking what was happening upstairs and whether there was an exit from the basement. When pressed about his identity, he explained that he was there to pick up his son when a teacher told him to hide. It seemed plausible. Parent picking up their kid gets caught in a lockdown, told to shelter wherever they can. Makes perfect sense, right? Except for one crucial detail that our storyteller discovered when they checked their phone to see what that text message had said. The message was from Dave, and it contained information that turned their blood to ice. Someone with a gun had shot Mr. Buckley, a teacher at the school. The shooter was described as wearing a red shirt and hat, and the message ended with a desperate warning. "Whatever you do, don't come upstairs." Our storyteller looked up from their phone to find themselves face to face with a man wearing exactly what the text had described. The realization hit like a physical blow. They weren't hiding with a concerned parent. They were alone in a basement with an armed individual who had just shot someone upstairs. The man seemed to catch on to their suspicious stare, and panic set in for both of them. There was only one thing to do: run. Our storyteller bolted for the stairs as a gunshot echoed through the basement, the bullet ricocheting off something metal in the darkness. By some miracle, it missed, and they made it upstairs to find police positioned at all exits, including the basement. The shooter was caught the moment he tried to leave, and thankfully, Mr. Buckley survived his injuries. It was later determined that the gunman had some kind of personal grievance with the teacher, though the details were never made public. What we do know is that an ordinary day at work nearly became a tragedy, and the sound of that gunshot will echo in our storyteller's mind forever. These three accounts share that same terrifying thread. Ordinary people going about their normal routines when reality decided to flip the script entirely. What strikes me most about these stories isn't just the randomness of the violence or the split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. It's how each person's survival hinged on details so small, so seemingly insignificant, that they could have easily gone the other way. Think about that first story for a moment. If the teacher hadn't been laid back enough to play games instead of teaching calculus, if they'd been in a different classroom, if the intruder had chosen a different route through the building, any of these tiny variables could have changed everything. The difference between a terrifying memory and a genuine tragedy was measured in footsteps and locked doors. And here's what really gets to me about these accounts. Every single person involved woke up that morning with plans. The student in calculus probably had weekend plans with friends. The middle schooler was thinking about what they'd do after the rain stopped. Our computer intern was looking forward to finishing their workday and heading home. None of them had survived a life-threatening encounter on their mental to-do list. But that's exactly how these situations unfold in real life. There's no dramatic music building in the background, no ominous foreshadowing, no sense that today is going to be different from any other day. Danger doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It walks in wearing ordinary clothes, speaking in everyday voices, hiding behind familiar faces. The basement story haunts me for a completely different reason, though. Because that wasn't random at all. That was someone who had planned this, who had thought it through, who had specifically targeted another human being. The fact that our storyteller ended up in the middle of it was coincidental, but the violence itself was deliberate and calculated. Imagine being in that position, realizing that the person you thought was helping you, the person you felt sorry for, the person you were trying to comfort in a scary situation, was actually the source of that terror. That moment of recognition when everything clicks into place and you understand that you've been having a conversation with someone who just tried to kill another human being. The psychological whiplash alone would be enough to leave lasting scars. What's particularly chilling is how convincing he was. His story made perfect sense. Concerned parent caught in lockdown looking for safety just like everyone else. If that text hadn't come through at exactly the right moment, if Dave hadn't sent those crucial details, our storyteller might have continued trying to help him find an exit. They might have walked right into a trap without ever realizing the danger they were in. These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the world we live in. We want to believe that we can spot danger, that our instincts will kick in, that we'll know when something isn't right. But the reality is much more complex and terrifying. Sometimes the people who seem the most harmless are the ones carrying weapons. Sometimes the safest places become the most dangerous. Sometimes our natural inclination to trust and help others puts us directly in harm's way. I've been thinking a lot about what separates the people who share these stories from the ones who don't get to share them anymore. Is it luck? Is it quick thinking? Is it some combination of preparation and circumstance that we can't quite define? The student who survived the school intruder didn't do anything heroic. They followed instructions, stayed quiet, waited it out. Their survival was largely passive. They were simply in the right place when the wrong person decided to move on. There's something both comforting and deeply unsettling about that. Comforting because it suggests that sometimes doing nothing is the right choice. Unsettling because it means survival can be completely out of our control. The middle school lockdown survivor was also largely passive, but their safety depended on adults making good decisions under pressure. Campus security acted quickly, parents and teachers coordinated effectively, and law enforcement resolved the situation before it escalated further. But what if any of those systems had failed? What if the response had been slower, less coordinated, less effective? Our computer intern, on the other hand, had to make an active choice. They had to recognize danger, process information quickly, and take decisive action despite overwhelming fear. Their survival depended not just on running fast enough to dodge a bullet, but on having the presence of mind to run in the first place. A few seconds of hesitation, a moment of doubt, and they might not be here to tell their story. But here's what really keeps me up at night thinking about these accounts. They're not anomalies. They're not once-in-a-lifetime events that happen to other people in other places. This stuff is happening everywhere all the time to people who never thought it would happen to them. How many times have you walked past someone on the street and had no idea what they were thinking, what they were planning, what they were capable of? How many times have you assumed you were safe because you were in a familiar place surrounded by familiar people? How many times have you trusted someone simply because they seemed normal, seemed harmless, seemed like they belonged? These stories aren't meant to make you paranoid. They're not meant to make you suspicious of every stranger or fearful of every new situation. But they should make you more aware, more conscious of your surroundings, more willing to trust that little voice in your head when something feels off, even if you can't quite put your finger on why. Because the thing about these situations is that they escalate so quickly. 1 minute you're playing brand logo games in calculus class, the next you're listening to someone threaten to kill everyone in the building. 1 minute you're eating lunch with your friends, the next you're trapped in a room while someone with a gun has a breakdown right outside your school. 1 minute you're having a sandwich at your desk, the next you're face to face with an armed intruder who's been pretending to be a victim. The window for recognizing danger and responding appropriately is often measured in seconds, not minutes. And in those crucial moments, your brain is fighting against everything it wants to believe about safety and normalcy and the predictability of daily life. That's why these stories matter. Not because they're entertaining or shocking, but because they reveal something fundamental about the world we navigate every single day. They show us that the line between ordinary and extraordinary, between safe and dangerous, between just another day and the worst day of your life, is much thinner than we want to believe. And maybe that's okay. Maybe acknowledging that uncertainty, that vulnerability, that fundamental unpredictability of human behavior makes us more prepared to handle whatever comes next. Maybe understanding that they're just stories until they aren't is the first step toward making sure we're ready when our turn comes to face the unthinkable. Because it's not a matter of if these situations happen. It's a matter of when, where, and whether we'll be among the ones who get to tell their story afterward. Stay vigilant out there, but don't let fear consume you. The reality is that most days are just ordinary days. And most people you encounter are just ordinary people living their ordinary lives. But awareness doesn't cost you anything, and it might just save everything. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't talk yourself out of that feeling just because it seems irrational. Our brains are incredibly sophisticated pattern recognition machines, and sometimes they pick up on things our conscious minds haven't fully processed yet. That uncomfortable feeling you get around certain people, that sense that something isn't quite right about a situation, that voice in your head telling you to leave. Listen to it. Practice situational awareness without becoming paranoid. Know where your exits are when you enter a room. Pay attention to the people around you without staring them down. Have a general sense of what's normal for your environment so you can recognize when something's off. These aren't survival skills reserved for combat veterans or security professionals. They're basic life skills that everyone should develop. And here's something that might surprise you. The people who survive these situations aren't usually the ones who think they're invincible, or the ones who've spent years preparing for every possible scenario. They're regular people who happen to make good decisions under pressure, who trusted their instincts when it mattered most, who got lucky with timing and circumstances beyond their control. The student hiding in that dark classroom didn't survive because they were brave or well-trained. They survived because they stayed quiet, followed instructions, and happened to be behind a door that held long enough for help to arrive. The person in the basement didn't make it out alive because they were some kind of action hero. They made it out because they paid attention to details, processed information quickly, and ran like hell when they realized what they were dealing with. These aren't superhuman feats, they're normal human responses that happen to align with survival in those specific moments, which means that you, sitting there listening to this right now, have just as much potential to handle whatever curveball life decides to throw your way. But the most important thing to remember is that these stories, as terrifying as they are, represent the exception rather than the rule. For every account of violence and danger, there are millions of people who went to school, went to work, went about their daily lives without incident. The vast majority of strangers you encounter will never pose any threat to you. Most locked doors will never be tested by someone trying to break them down. Most ordinary days will remain ordinary from start to finish. The goal isn't to live in constant fear of what might happen. It's to maintain just enough awareness to recognize when something genuinely dangerous is unfolding, and just enough preparation to respond effectively when that recognition hits you. Because at the end of the day, that's all any of us can do. We can't control the actions of unstable individuals or predict when someone will decide to bring violence into our otherwise peaceful world. We can't guarantee that we'll always be in the right place at the right time with the right response ready to go. But we can control how we move through the world. We can choose to pay attention rather than sleepwalk through our daily routines. We can choose to trust our instincts rather than rationalize away our concerns. We can choose to have basic plans for basic emergencies rather than assuming nothing bad will ever happen to us. And maybe, just maybe, those simple choices will be enough to ensure that when danger does cross our path, we'll be among the ones who get to share our stories afterward rather than becoming someone else's cautionary tale. So the next time you're sitting in a classroom, walking through a school hallway, working late in an empty building, or anywhere else where you feel safe and secure, remember these accounts. Not to make you afraid, but to make you aware. Not to make you paranoid, but to make you prepared. Because they're just stories until they aren't. And when that moment comes, if that moment comes, you'll want to be ready. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.